Alberta stands unique among the 10 Canadian provinces in many ways. One of the most notable is that it does not have a provincial sales tax. Also, it's super broke. There have been massive cuts from the Kenney government to education, healthcare, and many other sectors. Those cuts include
school teachers, school support staff, pre-K special needs education, higher education funding, childcare subsidies, doctor's pay, nurse positions, senior drug benefit, provincial parks, income assistance for the severely handicapped, Alberta agriculture and forestry, capital projects, and the corporate tax rate, which went down by 33%.
So with $1.3 billion in budget cuts, will a provincial sales tax save the Alberta economy, or will it obliterate it and consumer spending, leading to terrible consequences? Let's look at the data. Unlike south of the border in the United States, Canada has a 5% federal sales tax, or GST. And this holds uniformly across the entire country. So that means no matter where you are, if you purchase any sort of taxable good, which covers most things you may purchase, you will have to pay an additional 5%, which will go straight to Ottawa. Throughout Canada, each province has the option of setting its own provincial sales tax, or PST. Now, this can range at the low end from 6% in Saskatchewan all the way up to 10% in the Maritime provinces, with Alberta, of course, being unique and having zero provincial sales tax. I say unique. It's also worth pointing out that none of the territories have a provincial sales tax, but due to their small size and sort of unique population, they will not be considered in this data set, and we will only consider the 10 provinces of Canada. So if we were to take a naive analysis, we would note that in 2018, Alberta sent about $5.5 billion in GST revenue to Ottawa. So during that year, if we were to have instituted a 6% provincial sales tax, it seems like we would have collected $6.6 billion that we could have kept and used for government and public services. However, this is a bit naive because it doesn't account for the fact that instituting such a provincial sales tax would have a negative impact, or may have a negative impact, on consumer spending. And thus, the actual revenue coming from such a provincial sales tax would drop because, well, people would spend less money. For example, if I were to say, go out and get my Timmy's coffee, it's actually steep tea, well, under the old model, I would say pay about $2, not counting the 5% GST. However, if I were in Saskatchewan with a 6% PST, that would mean that my coffee or tea would cost about 12 cents more. So what does that mean? Well, that means that throughout the year, I may purchase fewer coffees or teas because of the fact that I have to pay an extra 12 cents. The question is that just a hypothetical argument, or is it something that we can actually see in the data? Does provincial sales tax have any effect on consumer spending in Canada? Well, luckily, thanks to Statistics Canada, we have access to data that we can use to analyze that question. So we're going to look at data of consumer spending from 2014 to 2018. How does GST revenue differ by province? So the first thing we're going to look at is the GST revenue, because it is uniformly applied across provinces, and we can use that to determine just how many taxable dollars are spent per capita by citizens of each of the 10 provinces across Canada. When we look at the data, well, what do you know? In 2014, Alberta reigned supreme, and in fact, Albertans spent the most money, that is the most taxable dollars per capita of any other province. They came in around $1,300, that is the average, the mean of $1,300 being sent to Ottawa in GST for every single Albertan in 2014. Next came British Columbia, coming in only at about $1,100, and it went down from there with Saskatchewan, Ontario, all of the rest, down to the very bottom where we have the very thrifty Quebecois, who only sent about $850 in GST revenue to Ottawa again in the year 2014. So when we first look at that, it seems to hint that, in fact, higher provincial sales tax leads to lower consumer spending on taxable goods. However, in 2018, things have changed slightly. Not Alberta, mind you. Alberta is still sending about $1,300 per person to Ottawa in GST taxes. However, British Columbia has increased quite drastically. Now they are tied with Alberta in the amount of spending that they do, that is, taxable spending. And other provinces have increased as well, such as Ontario and Quebec. In fact, we can actually fit a linear model to this data stratified by province. So we can look at the increase or lack thereof in GST dollars sent to Ottawa per year per capita. So in conclusion, for this model, we find that Albertans do in fact spend more money, more taxable dollars than any other province on average. But the other provinces are starting to catch up, and Alberta has not moved much in that 5-year span. How does GDP differ per province? Rather than looking at GST, which can tell us how many taxable dollars are being spent on average per person per province, we could also look at the GDP per capita per province to see just in some measure how wealthy the average citizens are for each province. And if we look at this across Canada, what do you know again? We find Alberta in the lead, having the highest GDP per capita across Canada. However, it's worth noting that when we fit a linear model to this data stratified by province, we actually see no significant change in the GDP of the provinces of Canada, except Alberta. Alberta's GDP has actually decreased on average of about $2,000 per capita per year. How does PST rate affect consumer spending? Before we talk about the PST rate, we have to consider the idea of a confounding variable, because there's a problem with our data set, and that's that PST rates do not change very much or change not at all within a given province. What that means is that, for example, Alberta has had 0 PST for the 5 years of our data set. Ontario has had an 8% GST for the 5 years of our data set, and they have not changed. What that means is that we cannot tell whether the increased spending in Alberta is due to the lack of PST, or maybe culturally Albertans are just more lavish spenders and Ontarians are thrifty. So we can't actually, that is, differentiate these two because of this confounding problem between our variables. So what we can do, though, to try to understand how PST might affect consumer spending is to assume cultural homogeneity across Canada. So it seems reasonable that the Canadian culture is homogeneous enough that differences in spending can be attributed to things like PST and not because the provinces are that culturally different. So this is a simplifying assumption that allows us to understand PST. Given all of that, we can fit a linear model treating the provincial sales tax as a continuous variable. And in doing that, what we note is that for every 1% increase in PST, what we see is about a $660 decrease in annual per capita taxable consumer spending. So in fact, increase in the PST will lead to people spending less money. Recall from our naive estimate at the beginning that a 6% PST in Alberta would probably give us about a $6.6 billion tax revenue that could be used by the government. But that ignores the effect that PST would have on consumer spending. Using this model that we just fit to the data, in 2018, if we had a 6% PST, much like Saskatchewan did, we can predict that the actual revenue would be somewhere between $4.2 and $5.6 billion. So it would be much less than $6.6 billion. However, it would still be a significant amount of money that could be used to fund public services, parks, and other ventures. However, PST only takes a few discrete values across Canada, and thus it may not be reasonable to treat it as a continuous random variable. Instead, we can partition it into an ordinal categorical variable. In that way, what we can do is split the PST rates across Canada into 4 categories. We can have the 0 category for Alberta, the low category for 5 or 6%. We can turn 7 and 8% into a medium category, and 9 and 10% into a high category. And then we can treat this as a categorical variable and, again, try to use this slightly different linear model to predict the tax revenue that Alberta would generate if they instituted a PST of 6%. Under this model, if Alberta were to have moved from the 0 category to the low category, that is, they would have a PST of about 5 or 6%, somewhat similar to Saskatchewan, what we would see here is a predicted revenue of about $3.9 to $5.5 billion. So again, it is lower than our naive estimate, but still a sizable chunk of money that could be used by the provincial government for various government and public services. In conclusion, I have to say I found this data quite interesting. First of all, it seems quite interesting that the increase in PST actually has, at least based on our data set, seems to have a significant effect on consumer spending. So that extra 15 cents or so that you're going to have to pay for your Tim Hortons in Quebec or the Maritimes actually does make a difference. Beyond that, it is also amazes me that the Alberta government can function while it has billions of dollars less than other provinces to work with because of the lack of a PST. So in similarly sized British Columbia across the Rockies, they have a similar population, but they also have about $7 to $8 billion in provincial sales taxes that they can use for various government purposes, public sector, and other ventures. So it amazes me that Alberta has survived this long without one. So I got to give them credit for that. But now that Alberta is facing massive cuts and financial troubles, is it time to actually institute a provincial sales tax? Well, if such a provincial sales tax is instituted, what would happen? Well, probably the government who did it would get kicked out because everybody would be somewhat annoyed. But in the end, it could actually lead to an improvement in the economy as a result of increased public services and support systems for people across the province. Regardless, if they do institute such an increase in the PST, it would be a great opportunity to look at the data.